Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. This excerpt from Twelfth Night is part of a letter to Malvolio, which used the allure of greatness to trick him to romantically accost Countess Olivia. While the ideal of greatness perhaps does not always give such malignant and extreme motivations, greatness nonetheless is a large inspiration to man, which spurs him to seek after this elusive quality himself. As seen in the letter to Malvolio, it appears there are a multitude of methods to achieve this ambition. And many other writings also contain a multitude of methods to achieve greatness based on varying understandings of its nature. Is the essential nature of greatness found in cleverness and courage in the affairs of the state, as described by Callicles? Are position and rank as a public figure fundamental to the great man, as thought by those in Tolstoy's time? Perhaps are mastery and exercising one's will, as examined by Hegel, necessary to be great? Because of the large and varied numbers of opinions on the nature of greatness, there's obviously some confusion on how one should seek it. With the drive man has for achieving greatness, understanding what greatness is and how one should seek it is of high importance so as not to go astray. What then does it mean to be great, and where does greatness lie? One popular opinion is that to be great, one must be a courageous, clever, and competent leader, which is the position held by Callicles in the Gorgias. As Callicles tells Socrates, the greatest men are those who are wise in the affairs of the state, courageous, being competent to accomplish their intentions. One man who embodies these ideals is Themistocles, who Plutarch recounts was, as a boy, naturally clever and strongly drawn to a life of action and public service. On seeing these traits, one of his teachers remarked that Themistocles would be a great man one way or the other, either for good or for evil. As his teacher predicted, Themistocles used his cleverness throughout his life in many ways. During the Greco-Persian War, he sent a message to the Persian king Xerxes urging him to attack at once, saying the Greeks are trying to slip away. Themistocles knew that the Greeks would likely be slaughtered if they left their advantageous position in the narrow waters of Salamis, and so sent this seemingly pretorious message to force a battle while the Greeks still had an advantage. Later, he slyly and successfully thwarted the Persians again by sending a false message that saying that the Greeks had decided to sail up the Hellespont and destroy the bridge of boats there. This bridge was the route of retreat for the Persian army, and upon receiving this message, Xerxes was thoroughly alarmed and at once set about arranging his withdrawal. These actions and many others helped the Greeks win the war, and Plutarch records that Themistocles was generally regarded as the man most directly responsible for saving Greece. Throughout his military career, Themistocles' cleverness and courage in dealing with others in the affairs of the state gave the Greeks an advantage and himself a name among men. However, just as his teacher predicted, Themistocles was also able to use his abilities for evil. A rival politician, Aristides, discovered that many members of the Athenian government had embezzled large sums of money, and none more than Themistocles. To cover up his crime, Themistocles used his influence to hide his guilt, unite a large number of people against Aristides, and prosecute him for malversation. Though Themistocles was truly guilty of mishandling the state's money, he was able to convince others that his enemy, who was trying to do good, was at fault. Though Themistocles was thought of as great by the Athenians for his cunning and steadfastness, these traits also allowed him to do ill while holding an appearance of greatness. Considering the example of Themistocles, is greatness in being a courageous, clever, and competent leader? With his leadership qualities, Themistocles was able to persuade his audience, whether friend or foe, of falsehoods. This practice of persuasion is termed rhetoric by Socrates in the Gorgias, who expounds that it is mere flattery which aims at what is pleasant, ignoring the good. Socrates explains further with the geometric equation that rhetoric is to justice what cookery is to medicine. Cookery is a form of flattery aiming to please with taste rather than give good nutrition like medicine. And so if a cook and a doctor had to contend who was an expert in wholesome and bad food, the doctor would starve to death. In a similar way, rhetoric is flattery in the political sphere and aims to persuade for personal benefit. Well, Themistocles' tricks against the Persians for the Athenians allowed him to save Greece and were arguably great from the Greek perspective. His rhetoric for personal gain was not. Though he gained money and harmed his enemies, these benefits to himself were accomplished by stealing from the state and harming a man who is working for the good of the people. By being a rhetorician, competent and skilled in the affairs of the state, Themistocles was able to hold himself in a position of apparent greatness while being a criminal. This is not true greatness, but rather only an appearance and a lie. Because competence and cleverness can be used for either greatness or deception and thievery, it can be seen that greatness does not lie solely in these traits. Another opinion is that position makes one great, as examined by Tolstoy. An example of a man remembered for his position is Julius Caesar. He was initially favored by the people for bringing unity and peace, and in hope that the government of a single person would give them time to breathe after so many civil wars and calamities, they made him dictator for life. However, due to his standing, he was given honors carried so excessively high that they made him odious. In effect, the people had begun to disfavor him due to their favor. Despite the growing disapproval, Caesar saw the favor of the people as the best and surest guard and entertained them with public feasting. This flattery of the people was to no avail, as even when Caesar performed necessary actions for the public, such as a reform of the calendar, even this gave offense to those who looked with an evil eye on his position. Despite his efforts in both flattery and reality, Caesar's so-called surest guard could not protect him, and he was removed from dictatorship by assassination, changing his Veni Vidi Vici into Passi Technon. Even the position of dictator, however much it seems to rule over the people, is itself ruled by their changing wills. In view of Caesar's rise and fall from power due to changing public opinion, is position where greatness lies? The frailty of political position is examined in the context of mathematics by Tolstoy in War and Peace. Tolstoy brings forward a mathematical metaphor from the realms of calculus to illustrate how a ruler relates to the actions of the ruled, beginning by describing continuity and discontinuity using a paradox of motion. One such paradox is referred to as Zeno's dichotomy, which arises from a discontinuous understanding of motion and the logical idea that one must first cross half of a space before crossing the entirety. Additionally, one must cross half of this half, and half of that half, which divides up the space by half ad infinitum, creating an infinite number of steps to reach the opposite side of the room. One can never complete an infinite number of steps and will therefore, paradoxically, never reach the other side of the room. While the assumption that one must cross half of this room is correct, the idea that motion is discontinuous is not. The paradox arises from understanding motion as occurring in a space that is discontinuous and can be divided into an infinite number of infinitely small parts. If motion is instead understood as continuous and occurring across the integration or summation of the infinite divisions of space, one can simply move across this continuity. Tying this mathematical explanation back into the political realm, Tolstoy explains that political position is also a continuous integration. The movement of humanity arising from innumerable arbitrary human wills is continuous. Just as motion is understood by summing its infinitely small and many parts, so too, to study the laws of history, we must completely leave aside kings and study the common, infinitesimally small elements by which the masses are moved. Rather than the traditional thought that those with position hold authority, the true power of so-called great men lies in the nebulous will of the many, which moves men in and out of power. Because position is simply a summation of the wills of the people, by itself, it holds little value. Caesar became favored due to the people's desire for peace, and he became disfavored not by any personal fault or action, but rather due to that favor. When the people did react to his qualities and actions, their favor did not correlate to the reality of both his flattery and truly good actions, as seen when they responded negatively to his necessary reform of the calendar. If, perhaps, Caesar had been as cunning a rhetorician as Themistocles, he could have lied to the people and been thought of as great, once again showing that the will of the people is independent from any presence or lack of greatness found in the one in position. While Caesar may have appeared great for a time as dictator, Tolstoy would agree that it is simply an empty name and invidious glory. Thus, position is an arbitrary favor of the people and does not correlate to the nature of its holder, showing that it is not the sole source of greatness. While greatness is not in position, does mastery make one great? This opinion is examined by Hegel and is exemplified in the life of Cato the Younger, the austere contemporary of Caesar. During Cato's time as a military officer, whatever he commanded to be done, he himself took part in performing. In his apparel, his diet, and mode of traveling, he was more like a common soldier than an officer. By appearing humble and working alongside his men, Cato was able to truly exercise his authority over them, and at length his men were so well disciplined that it was hard to say whether they were more peaceable or more warlike. Though he had an unassuming appearance compared to other commanders, in character he far exceeded all that had names and titles. For his actions he acquired in the fullest measure what had been his least desire to seek, glory and good repute. Instead of seeking to make himself great, Cato became so through ignoring greatness and striving toward mastery. Although Cato was virtuous and great in his life, his death was another matter. Because of his resistance to Caesar's tyranny, Cato would need to accept the tyrant's pardon in order to continue living. Rather than suffer the disgrace of owing his life to his tyrannical adversary, Cato took his sword, and when he saw that the point was good, "Now," said he, "I am master of myself," and soon after stabbed himself. He was unable to dispatch himself quickly and lay weltering in his blood the great part of his bowels out of his body. Though a doctor would have stitched him back together, Cato, recovering himself, thrust aside the physician, plucked out his own bowels, and expired. Cato's suicide in many ways showed remarkable self-mastery. He threw aside all ideas of safety and life to replace them with pain and death in order to complete his goal of pacifying his pride. His determination was far-reaching. Not only did he bring himself to begin disembowelment, he also finished with his bare hands despite immense pain. Cato truly exercised mastery, but was this greatness? Although he did achieve his objective of suicide through self-mastery, he had forgotten the responsibility and the purpose of his mastery. Had he submitted to the disgrace of Caesar's pardon, he could have continued to fight for the good of the people under tyranny. Instead, rather than continuing in life to serve others, Cato sought to serve his ego and paradoxically became a slave to his own pride through mastery. This conundrum that mastery leads to slavery is explored by Hegel in Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel argues that what the bondsman does is really the action of the Lord, as the Lord or master's will is carried out by the slave or bondsman. Because the will of the master rests in the existence of the slave, the master becomes secondary and dependent on the bondsman. The Lord also becomes subservient to his own desires, seeking to carry out whatever they command, further showing him to be an unessential consciousness, its unessential action, and enslaved. Even if one assumes there is some greatness in mastery, it is unobtainable, as mastery leads to slavery to one's desires. In effect, then, mastery only contains the ill associated with being ruled by one's passions, showing that greatness must lie somewhere else. Across all views on greatness, one consistent need arises. If greatness is in being wise and courageous in the affairs of the state, one must use those qualities for good in the service of others and not for devious personal gain. If greatness is in position, one must act rightly and serve others regardless of the wills of the people. In all cases, one must have virtue and work for the good of others rather than only oneself. An example of one who put these ideals of slavery and leadership into practice is Aristides, earlier mentioned as the rival of Themistocles and the one who exposed his theft. On occasions when Aristides saw that the laws he proposed were truly necessary for the well-being of the people and the state, he would advance them under the names of other men so that Themistocles would not oppose measures which could benefit the entire community simply out of personal antagonism. By putting forth these bills under the names of other men, Aristides was able to cleverly pass them and benefit the people at the expense of not receiving the associated recognition, showing he cared more for their good than for fame. Further, during the proceedings on one of his proposed bills, Aristides understood from the speeches of his opponents that it would prove a bad measure and withdrew it, once again displaying his desire for what was true. Gaining a reputation for upright conduct and disregarding partisan politics, Aristides earned the title of the Just. In these instances, Aristides showed remarkable character in caring for what was true and not what was only pleasant for himself, giving him favor from the people and the virtue needed by the other forms of greatness. Aristides showed further character when Themistocles used the title of the just to arouse jealousy in the people and force a vote for ostracism. During the vote, Aristides was famously so upstanding that he wrote his own name on an ostracon for an illiterate man who was only sick of hearing him called the just. He could have decreased his chances of losing by writing someone else's name on the ostracon with no consequences, as the illiterate man would never know, but instead chose to have integrity and do what was right simply because it was correct and virtuous. Beyond this, Aristides even returned from exile when asked to do so during the war with the Persians, to cooperate with Themistocles and the Athenians despite their poor treatment of him. By continually being a slave to the people and disregarding his own will and ambitions, Aristides became virtuous and just, allowing him to use his cleverness and position for greatness. The reasoning behind the greatness of Aristides and those who follow the path of servitude is also examined by Hegel, who describes how through his service, the slave rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every detail. By not being attached to his own existence, the slave focuses virtuously on the purpose of others, allowing him to act for their good rather than only himself. In obtaining the title of the just, Aristides showed himself to be a servant of the people who looked beyond his own small existence into virtue and the divine. Plutarch conveys that the just is an unusual title. Rulers usually preferred renown founded on power or violence, or titles reflecting their great deeds in conquering. Though seeking to mirror the divine and appear great, these men wrongly seek after unobtainable and chance-ridden attributes of it. Plutarch says that men long for immortality, to which no flesh can obtain, and for power, which remains for the most part in the hands of fortune, will they give virtue the last place in their schemes of values. Additionally, without virtue, neither immortality nor power are truly divine, for injustice renders them merely brutish. Through obtaining virtue through his service, the slave can become great. The stance that servanthood and virtue are man's connection to greatness in the divine is also the biblical position. Jesus did not come to conquer, but rather to serve even to death by crucifixion. In Matthew 20, after a disagreement among the disciples as to who would be the most powerful in the kingdom of God, Jesus spoke to them saying, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be this way among you, but whomever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life a ransom for many." Rather than seeking to be masters, Jesus encourages his disciples to work altruistically for the good of others as their servants in order to be great. The Bible also expresses that the supposedly insignificant person can be great by having virtue in a servant's heart, such as in the account of the widow's mite. While rich men were donating large sums of money to the temple, a poor widow gave only 2 small copper coins. Though the widow's donation was of considerably less monetary value than the donations of the wealthy, Jesus tells his disciple that the poor widow put in more than all of them. Despite the appearance that the larger donations were of more value, the widow's donation was of larger significance due to her greater altruism in giving. The wealthy gave out of their surplus money and continued to live comfortable lives, but the widow sought to serve even to the point that she gave all she had to live on, allowing her small action to be great. From these 2 biblical examples, it can be seen that one should seek to follow the example of Jesus by being virtuous and a servant of others if one wishes to be great. However, that is not to say that greatness lies solely in virtue or altruism either. Aristides was not only good-willed, he also was clever and held position at times. While attributes such as power do need virtue to make them divine, virtue also requires some measure of power or ability to have an effect. Even the widow needed the 2 small coins in order to express her servant's heart in giving, showing that some, however small level of power or potency, is necessary for greatness. In addition, incompetence combined with virtue is not great, as seen clearly in the parable of the talents. In Matthew 25, Jesus describes 3 servants put in charge of their master's money. 2 of the servants, wishing to do good for their master, used the money they stewarded wisely, and so doubled the amount before returning it. The 3rd servant, while also wishing to serve, buried the money so that he would not lose any. Though the 3rd servant wished to do good in returning the full amount, The master rebukes him for being a wicked, lazy slave. Despite his goodwill in wanting to return the master's money, his lack of competence in action meant that he could not do the best with what he was given. The other servants, however, being both competent and good-willed, The other servants, however, being both competent and good-willed, combined these characteristics to their fullest effect. When the opportunity for greatness arose from their master entrusting funds to them, they were able to seize upon it and perform their duties well. While the individual aspects of competence, altruism, chance by themselves are not greatness, they are all still important aspects that contribute to greatness. Ultimately, then, where does greatness lie? Courage and cleverness, as described by Callicles, can lead to great falsehood, a leader who appears great through deception while he is in reality a criminal. Position, as examined by Tolstoy, is simply an arbitrary title given by arbitrary people. Nothing of the greatness it may seem to be. Finally, a good will is practically useless by itself as it accomplishes nothing. However, the combination of the competence one has, the position one has been entrusted with, and the goodwill allows one to be a servant to others in great. One may find great men with varying ratios of these attributes from all states of life, from dictator to impoverished widow, but the combination of these traits backed by a goodwill is the essence of greatness. Across varying levels of all these factors, one must seek to do the best one can, backed with a heart of service and a connection to the divine, in order to find where greatness truly lies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. You take kind of controversial position in your paper where you say that incompetence combined with virtue is not great. And I'd like you to elaborate on why moral virtue in and of itself cannot be sufficient to compromise greatness.
Well, as stated in the paper, and also specifically in the example I used, the parable of the talents, we see that there is a slave who is wishing to do good, but obviously has some level of altruism or virtue in wanting to do what is good, but he cannot, due to his incompetence, do good with that. You have to have, in order to have some worldly greatness, you must have, one, the will to do good, and you must also have the ability to use that will to do good.
Mm-hmm. So the slave that takes his money and buries it in the ground, he's very honest and saves his master's money.
Yes.
So he's very moral. He doesn't understand much about investing, though. You do not get a very good return from soil. So would you say that, well, okay, that's an interesting concept. Could you flesh, the biblical parable is interesting. Could you flesh that out in more examples that would perhaps show a little broader application of that principle?
Let's see. Like what sort of example would you?
Well, that's what I was asking you for.
Okay.
But it's very clever to ask me back. So, the parable that Jesus gives, it seems to be a very good example of one who does something that is quote unquote right. He does the right thing, and yet it's completely worthless. And then he wants to be seen as right as well. He comes to the master and says, I can bring forward to you my moral rightness. I saved it for you. And he's rebuked.
Yes.
And I guess rightly so. Even though what he did was right, he returned, as Plato would say, he returned to his master his due.
Mm-hmm.
He did not steal it. So can you give another example wherein you could say that one does the moral thing, but should still be rebuked?
Sorry. Just think of an example on the spot here. well, of course, there was the other example I gave in my paper of the wealthy giving, from their surplus, and perhaps also in that case, putting large amounts of small denominations of coins in so that the box would ring, as the historians say. So that is it's morally good to give to the temple, but they are perhaps not giving as I don't. This is a weird example, but they're perhaps not. They're doing it. They're doing it in order to. They're doing a virtuous action, but they're doing it in a way that isn't necessarily the best, just simply for the virtue. They do have their competence. They do have their ability to give to the temple with their money, but they perhaps should be rebuked for their actions in giving that they gave in sort of a wrong way.
Well, in that example, the rebuke seems to be based primarily on the immorality of the action, of the ostentatiousness, putting large amounts of small change in so that it's heard. That's ostentatious. That's immoral in itself. I guess the action I'm looking for is an action that, on the plane of morality, is completely unquestionable. Where there's nothing wrong with the morality. All the morality is sound. And yet, because of the presence of a lack of competence, that the individual should still be rebuked. Is it ever true that you can say, you have done the right thing, but shame on you because you did not do the great thing?
Well, I suppose it's a little bit complicated because generally when you do an action, there is some level of greatness involved. Even in the case of the slave, there was some level of greatness involved that he didn't go and squander the money gambling or something like that. Perhaps he could have been greater if he had used the money wisely rather than simply hiding it away. But he did have, as I say at the end of the paper, he had altruism. He did also act, and he had a chance given to him by the master, but he did not use it for as full of greatness as he could have if he had been competent.
Well,
so it's oftentimes when there's an action, it's hard to say that it isn't perhaps greatness, but to say that they could have been a lot greater had they been more competent or more virtuous or been given a bigger chance to perform their competence and virtue than they are absolutely great.
Well, I'll give you a controversial example.
Okay.
I'm thinking of my student Arwen. Arwen went off, and by the time she was 22, she graduated from college at I think 18. By the time she was 22 or maybe 24, I think she had a double doctorate in neurosurgery and research medicine. And a very nice homeschool girl. Okay? Now, if my daughter or my son got a brain tumor, Arwen could be very nice and show compassion on my child and operate and take out their brain tumor and set them on a course for being able to prosper the rest of life. Now, unmentioned other homeschool girl might spend her late teens and 20s seeking the desire to be a godly wife. And because of that, she does nothing that will get in the way of her being available to be that godly wife if perchance a right young man comes along. Now, my son gets a brain tumor, and other young lady says, I want to help your son. I can make him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I say, thank you, and I say to her, thank you so much for wanting to help my son. But shame on you that you are not trying to develop the skill where you could be of substantial help to my child by being able to perform brain surgery.
It would have been cool if you would have gone and been a neurosurgeon. But, they can also be an extremely good mother as well, which is something that's also needed. As I say in the paper, there's, perhaps dictators who are good at being dictators and widows who are good at being widows. But I think that perhaps the fact that she didn't pursue it shows that it was not something that she truly was inclined for, and that it was more proper for her to pursue the role of motherhood. And I think that's pretty much the case in most situations.
All right, thank you very much. Can you say more about can you summarize for us the various attributes of greatness that you developed throughout your paper? You use quite a number of different examples, and for those of us who don't have the capacity for such great mental comprehension, who are very tired at this time, could you just kind of break it down as to what are some of the characteristics that you would say could add the quality of greatness to an otherwise just moral character?
Yeah, so the two sort of other attributes besides morality are the opportunity of position and chance. It sort of goes into chance and general, where you are given you are put in a place where you're given the ability to perform using your virtue and your competence. And the other one is competence, where these are skills, natural inclinations, that you can learn or have that allow you to exercise your virtue in those specific instances you are given.
When Jesus says, "Let the little children come unto me," and he says, "Of such are those of the kingdom of heaven," he seems to be saying that the Christian life is, in a sense, a childlike existence. And isn't that indicating that the nature of particularly Christian greatness is something that, like children, does not involve a great deal of competence or worldly strength and skill?
I think that's more so referring to in dealing with your Christian walk. Also, you see that you're supposed to have childlike faith, and it's hard for people who have perhaps great things entrusted to them, like rich people, to become have that childlike faith. However, that's not to say that one shouldn't pursue worldly greatness in order to perhaps even be used by God for greatness for His kingdom. So I think that one can have childlike faith and lion-like greatness at the same time.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Ben, I love it. It was fantastic. My first question was, I was thinking as you're describing what true greatness is and serving others and all that, having morality, it seems a lot like that's also like the formula for happiness in a fulfilled life. So what's the distinction you would make between greatness and living a happy fulfilled life?
Well, I think living a happy, fulfilled life would perhaps being very competent and virtuous, but having greatness thrust upon you, where all of a sudden all your sins decide, oh, we're going to make this guy dictator. That's not really the best thing if you truly are in it for ruling the people well. Being a politician isn't that much fun. Everybody hates you. There's going to be a lot of hardships that you're going to go through. Oftentimes the chance that's given to you is a hardship. So I would say, perhaps in that sense, if you don't like hardships, it's not going to be very happy. But if you do, if you are able to persevere through those hardships, perhaps you will get fulfillment and moral happiness from that. In the sense, so in that sense, you could say that perhaps being great could be happiness. Hopefully, you don't have to. Hopefully, you can have an instance of being great, and then you can stop having to deal with the trials. Though.
And then under this notion of dictator, would you support the notion that absolute power corrupts?
I would say that absolute power and perhaps really anything does have a general tendency to corrupt when overused.
Okay. Then, can there really be a just or truly great dictator, or do you think, in general, because a dictator by definition is given all the power, they cannot be a moral or truly great person?
I think perhaps to allude to, there's a Greek phrase that says what's the rarest thing to see an aged tyrant. Perhaps the rarest thing to see is a great tyrant who's been in power for a long time, being that power has a tendency to corrupt over time. I think that there perhaps can be, or I do think that there can be a dictator who is truly great. It perhaps would be very rare considering politicians in general, as well as people in general, tend to be not that great. Yeah, I do think that there can be a dictator, however rare it may be. Ben.
I love your paper, but is greatness relative? Like, for one thing, you said there was a lady who gave, like the one night that was her everything, then there's people who gave a little bit of all of the stuff that was more than hers, but it was still less to them. What if someone was born with like less intelligence, just like they had everything was against their advantage, and then there was another person who was born where everything was for their advantage. If the person who had, like, let's say they even had less work ethic, so they didn't even work for it harder than the person who had more advantage, but like proportionately they got the same amount done, would they both be equally great?
I would say that the person who, if they proportionally got the same amount, perhaps proportionally to their virtue, got the same amount done, I would still consider the person who was able to perform more greatness to be more great. However, I think that it's not perhaps necessary for everyone to, not everyone can be Bill Gates, not everyone can be, Caesar, if you consider him great. So I think that, perhaps it's not a super important distinction, but I would still consider that the person who accomplished more with the virtue would be great. Especially also the subject of work ethic is a little bit interesting there, perhaps going back to Sophie's paper. But yeah, there's that too.
Yeah, because with the work ethic, a lot of times, like with people who have less gifts, like how they attain greatness is by, even though they don't accomplish as much, they work harder.
Yes, definitely.
But yeah, also, so you're saying that not everyone can be great, because I feel like there's a connotation in greatness that it's like rising above everyone else, and so that's why everyone can be great. Because if everyone was great, then you'd have to be above great to actually be great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Ella.
Really good paper.
Thank you.
It's quite a theatrical experience still. Good job with that. So I have a couple questions. The first being, do you think there's potential to do great things without necessarily having good morals? Because in an example of building atomic bombs, that was a huge discovery in science, and that really pushed the boundaries of science, but it also kills quite a few people. So do you think
Yes.
that?
Yeah, I think that the actions themselves can be perhaps considered great as much as any action can be considered great, as much as anything that's not human can. I mean, it had a large effect. So in that sense, it could be considered great. Actions and discoveries generally don't have much moral value to them. Like as Augustine says, basically everything is created by God, and therefore it's good, and it's just little privations of evil away from that basically by moral nature that make them good or bad. So I think that the atomic bomb is pretty fascinating, and I would say that it is a great discovery. As the English language is fun; you slur everything together. But I don't think it has any moral value in itself. It's just how one use it. perhaps you could say, well, was bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was that great? But I don't know if the atomic bomb itself was could
Okay.
be considered.
Okay, and then my other question was, so you opened your paper with a quote from Twelfth Night.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could give an example based on the definition of greatness you gave. Someone who was born great, someone who had achieved greatness, and someone who had greatness thrust upon them.
Well, I kind of see that as actually in some ways as the individual aspects of greatness being pushed into one thing where you are born with certain innate abilities, you practice, you exercise, you learn, and you achieve greatness in some ways, and then also perhaps you're given an opportunity to exercise those things and you have greatness thrust upon you. So in a sense, I think that anyone who is great has all of those things happen to them. So, yeah. Dawson.
So I enjoyed your paper. So in your conclusion, you basically say we should strive to be virtuous but also be clever. So for greatness. And I was wondering if you think you wouldn't pursue greatness, but pursuing virtues and being clever, you become great. So I was wondering if your first two topics, if mastery and if position comes along with that, because it seems like it seems like he wasn't trying to have position, or he wasn't trying to be a master of anything, but with his virtue and with his cleverness, those came along with it. So I was wondering if it just comes, if you try to be virtuous.
Well, I think there is a certain extent where you perhaps may be more innately inclined towards virtue. Perhaps you've been, or you may be more innately inclined not to be virtuous, or you may be more innately inclined to be clever or not. But there still is a point to practicing those things. Whereas, and there is a point to maybe if you're into that sort of thing, seeking position. But I don't think that there's as much of the whole thing that happens with mastery, where you sort of go down the wrong path in seeking it. That's why you're not actually supposed to seek mastery. You're supposed to seek to be serve each other. It's like, does that answer your question? Yeah. Jonathan.
Okay, so it was a really good paper, really active. What I was wondering is you used the example of the widow giving the mic, and so you called that great, right?
Yes.
Yes. What's the similarity between that and, because there's not really anything clever about that. So I was wondering, how is there cleverness, because she could have been pretty much like an idiot type of person, and really not been that smart, but Jesus said she was the greatest of all.
Yeah.
All of these.
I would say that perhaps maybe not all situations you need to be particularly clever, but perhaps you do need your some competence, some ability, which is the coins that she had to give, as well as virtue. So cleverness is a form of competence which can be used for greatness when combined with virtue and chance.
So I was just thinking, and is there a distinction between great people, greatness, and great actions? Because touching on what Ella was saying, so I feel like the discovery of something like the atomic bomb can be like a great action, but because there's not the morals, maybe it's not greatness or great people. So if that's the case, what's the distinction? How do you distinguish between all those things?
Yeah, so you said greatness, great actions, and great people.
Yeah.
So greatness would, of course, be like sort of the general idea behind both great men and great actions. And great actions would be actions as far as they can have moral worth, that would have all three of those, all three of the attributes listed there. Perhaps if you have an action that's more amoral, such as scientific discoveries. You could have those great actions, or sort of large actions perhaps would be a more, like actions that have a big effect, versus greatness, that they could be, you know, sort of carried out by someone of any disposition, as long as, you know, they have the ability to actually do the action. And but the difference with great men is that we definitely have virtue, and we really need to work on that as well as with our cleverness and our competence. So perhaps anybody could accomplish a large action, but to be great is different.
Do you think that someone can truly become great if they are specifically seeking greatness?
It might not be very helpful in becoming great, but I do think that there's a chance that it could.
Yeah, so in your conclusion, you're saying essentially that if you kind of examine all of the different things that will have kind of been considered great through, you kind of looked at all those and said it's not really any one of them, but you kind of have to put them together.
Yes.
And just to restate them, I think you mentioned courage, cleverness, position, mastery, which I thought you meant self-mastery, but I could have been mistaken there, and goodwill.
Yes.
Okay.
Mastery is a little bit complicated because self-mastery is kind of important, but it's more so the idea of exercising your will over other people. So I end up sort of concluding that that sort of mastery is, according to Hegel especially, is not good for greatness. But of course, the competence, the cleverness as a part of competence, the virtue, and the chance are all parts of greatness.
Right. So regarding those things, would you say, in a sense, that if they're all necessary components of greatness, then to the degree of which you have more of each of them, a greater level of each of them, you are greater?
Yeah, you can definitely have different ratios of them, but I think, yeah, if you have more of them, especially if you have proportionate amounts of virtue and the other two, then you would be more great.
Okay. So, I guess I wonder about how that affects our view of our own lives, a Christian, for instance. Christianity tends to emphasize virtue.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem to tend to talk about position a lot. It kind of says, to work from where you are. And you have said here that you can find great people with varying ratios of the attributes from all states of life.
Mm-hmm.
But doesn't it seem from the view of position that to be really a really great person, you'd have to have quite a lot of position? Like if we're saying that to have more of these is to make you greater, to have more position would make you greater.
Yes,
Is that not so? So somebody in a low position, such as the widow,
yes.
could never really be truly great in the sense that a king could.
Yeah, I mean, she couldn't, if the king was as virtuous as the widow, then, of course, the king perhaps would be able to exude more greatness. But I don't know if we can say that that's the only true form of greatness. I think that the widow's small actions with her extreme amount of virtue were still great.
So it would be a matter of degree then.
Yes.
And so I'm saying that in conclusion, you could possibly talk about the other ones too, but just to me it stuck out that with position, people in a lower position of life do not have the same potential for greatness as people in a high position of life.
Not that they necessarily don't have, well, perhaps the same, might have different sort of instantaneous propensity for greatness, but still, someone in a low position of life, it's not like we have a hard set caste system. People can move up, people can move down, just as depends on the chance. So yeah, I'd say that. But instantaneous, if everybody just stayed the same in the same level, then yes, there would be less ability. There would be less ability for them to do it. Mr. Hendricks.
Yeah, can we go back to discussing the instance with the widow's mite in more detail? I was just thinking it's helpful to think about it in terms of how contrary it is to the usual recognition that comes in the world for contributions. I mean, if you're giving to the United Way, you send 2 pennies into the United Way, you're probably not even going to get a thank you letter.
Yes.
You donate $1 million, you'll get a call from the president. You donate, $500 million, you'll have buildings named after you, and all sorts of stories told about you. I mean, so in the world, the acknowledgement of these things comes in proportion to the size of them.
Yes.
And Jesus looks at the widow and sees her put her 2 mites in and says that this is the one to take notice of. She just gave all of her money. Now, the one who gives the $500 million is most likely not giving all of his money because he probably has another $300 million stashed away somewhere. And so, in the case of the widow's mite, it seems that what Jesus is pointing us towards is the sense of sacrifice involved in the action.
Yes.
And so, is that not showing that greatness does not lie in competence, but the depth of the sacrifice that's made?
Yes, the depth of the sacrifice, the amount of servitude, the virtue is perhaps an extreme magnifying factor in greatness, but there still has to be power and potency in order to have there be greatness. And just as you can see, if the person who gave $500 million, if they had perhaps, this is sounding extremely judgy towards rich people, but if they had the same amount of altruism as the widow, they could have been extremely great. But it just the fact that altruism is a large magnifying factor, and that does not erase the necessity of there being some level of power and chance.
All right. So if the widow, instead of having 2 mites, had 500 million mites, and she gave every one of her 500 million mites, you would say in that instance now the level of
Express greatness.
no, the level of
Altruism.
the word I just used. When she gives the 2 mites, she gives everything that she has. The extent to which her suffering is going to be, the suffering given to her own life is total. If she had 500 million mites and she gave every 500 million of them, her suffering would be the same. She would be impoverished by the action. And so you would say in that instance, are you saying that her greatness would be the same, or are you saying that in the case of the 500 million mites, that at that point there would be a larger level of greatness involved in that action than when she puts in the 2 mites?
Yeah, there would be a larger amount of greatness involved that she performed this very virtuous action in giving, perhaps not a wise action, but a very virtuous action in giving all of this money to the temple. Her amount of sort of altruism would be the same, suffering and servanthood would be the same, but the fact that she gave more money to the temple would mean that the total amount of expressed greatness would be higher. That's the question.
Yeah, and one last question. If greatness and you might say morality can be identified as 2 different concepts, we understand that morality is obviously a goal that we should have.
Yes.
Would you say that greatness is legitimate as a goal to have for attainment?
I think perhaps being prepared by training one's virtue and training one's competence in education and reading the Bible, attempting to be do good for other people. that would be important. And in the case that, just in case that the opportunity for greatness arises, so that one can exercise that. So in a sense, yes, that being prepared for the opportunity of greatness should be something that we should all strive for.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Maybe the greatness is somewhat what is in the eye of the beholder, I think. And that, my question is, you've looked at greatness, I think, from the standpoint of different virtues in people from our position. Do you think Almighty God has the same perspective of what greatness is?
Well, I mean, I do use biblical examples at the end, so that's kind of a nice defense there. But I would hope that I came close to what God would be considered to be greatness. I think that from the examples I use from the Bible, that it's seeing that there has to be some virtue, there has to be virtue, and there has to be some ability to express that virtue. Perhaps God might have a slightly different definition of greatness than I'm using. But I think I would sincerely hope that we have very similar definitions. Josh.
Hi Ben, thank you. I really enjoyed your paper. I'd say that it is great. No, but so my question is, so when people learn, like, or at least when I think of greatness, I think of examples like in the movie Whiplash, where he's trying to be a great drummer,
Yes.
or and I know you've seen that movie, and Achilles, where he is a great fighter. Just a bunch of different examples where they're great at one aspect, but is it really possible to say that anyone's like a man is great? He was a great man, and if not, is being great just kind of a vain pursuit that man got caught up in?
It can be a vain pursuit, as perhaps anything can be, and it can be very destructive, as seen in the case of Achilles and the drummer. But as far as there being a great man, seeing that we all will always have faults, it's kind of hard to say that one person could just be entirely great. I'm sure Aristides had his faults, and we see Cato definitely had his. So I'm not sure that there really can be like a fully just straight great man. You could perhaps say that our ideal we're striving towards is Jesus. So Jesus is obviously all virtue and all opportunity and ability. But to say that humans themselves could be completely great is hard. But to say that humans could be very high on the greatness scale is possible. Thank you. This is Brian.
Ben, my question is, how would you factor in the conversation that Jesus has with his disciples, where they come and say, they ask this very question, who's going to be the greatest? How can we do it? And his advice to them is, be like little children and be the lowliest. So how would that factor into your conversation on greatness?
If we're going off of, I do include that section here. I believe it actually says to be servants in that sense, lowly, not necessarily children, child slavery. But I do think definitely that being small, perhaps ironically, can help you end up being great, where you don't look out for your own will and ambitions, but you look out for other people. Does that answer your question?
You may have partly answered the question I was going to ask there. It seems like then, if being small and looking out for, therefore being more inclined to look out for others' interests is part of the mark of greatness, is that kind of what you were talking about when you saying goodwill?
Yes,
and so, in a sense, goodwill has to do with doing things for others.
Yes.
Okay, because I was going to ask, when it came to greatness, about Christ, who was in a position of being God, coming down to earth, thereby lowering quite a lot of the things on this list insofar as he's, as a man at least, he's now not fully God. He's fully God, of course, and fully man, but he's not merely God. He's man also. As a man, it's difficult. The theology is difficult, but at very least, among men,